A single drumbeat cracked through the darkness as Sister Eleni was marched toward Topkapi's bronze gate, the soldiers' boots grinding frost into dust beneath her bare feet. A confiscated prayer tablet swung from a guard's belt, its carved chronicler's line declaring, "The Empire counts bodies long before it counts sins." The words embedded themselves in her ribs like cold nails. Lantern light trembled across the other captured girls. Sister Magdalena clutched a rosary stripped of its cross, her breath shaking as though each exhale risked shattering. A palace scribe lifted an inked ledger fragment, pressing it to Eleni's cheek to match a number to her face, reducing her identity to tally marks meant for imperial record rather than remembrance. Regret tightened her breath. She recalled the convent's quiet warmth, the scent of baked bread, the dim glow of candles shared between sisters. All of it felt impossibly distant beneath the looming gate that divided sanctuary from subjugation. The bronze gate groaned open, releasing a gust thick with incense, boiled oil, and iron. As she stepped forward, torchlight carved harsh shapes along the courtyard walls, turning each stone into a silent witness. The architecture felt alive, an immense body breathing around her, indifferent to those entering its lungs. Eleni straightened despite the cold gnawing at her ankles, clutching the frayed cloth Sister Magdalena had given her. It smelled faintly of lavender and smoke, the last fragile echo of her former life. The soldiers fell silent as an official in embroidered robes approached, his gaze sweeping over the new captives with mechanical calculation. He searched not for stories, but for utility. Above them, the upper galleries curved like predatory jaws. Within the shadows, a figure remained still, watching with an attention that weighed heavier than chains. A distant bell tolled, its sound more like an imperial count than an invitation to prayer. A servant passed, her expression carved from resignation, offering neither comfort nor warning. The bronze gate slammed shut behind Eleni. Its iron shutter echoed through her bones. The world beyond disappeared, leaving only the scraped stone beneath her feet and the path that pulled her deeper into the palace's unyielding grip. She lifted her chin, tasting resolve edged with fear. The unseen watcher in the gallery did not move. It simply waited. Perfume coiled through the preparation chambers as Sister Eleni stepped beneath wavering oil lamps, their flames trembling like anxious hearts that beat in time with her own rising dread. The air felt thick, saturated with rosewater, and the faint bitterness of crushed herbs meant to calm the nerves of girls who had no say in their fate. Layla Hatton guided her gently yet firmly, her hands steady but her eyes darkened with the weight of memory. She urged Eleni to breathe slowly, as attendants began the cleansing rites that stripped each captive of the life she carried before dawn's rupture. Cold water cascaded over her shoulders, rinsing away the dust of the road and the remnants of her former identity. Beneath the polished basin, Eleni noticed a small groove in the marble, an inscription etched by a forgotten captive. "Silence is the first chain they teach you to wear." The words pressed themselves into her spine more sharply than any iron shackle could. She traced the edge of the carving with her thumb, the gesture hidden beneath the steam that veiled her expression. Attendants circled with practiced efficiency, cutting away her convent garments and replacing them with silk that clung to her skin like a second, unwanted conscience. The fabric shimmered beneath lamplight, beautiful in a way that felt accusatory rather than comforting. Other novices stood nearby, their gazes lowered, their movements choreographed to avoid both attention and rebellion. One girl's hand shook as she folded her discarded clothes. Another whispered a prayer so quietly it dissolved before reaching the air. Fear curled deep within Eleni, a tight knot that refused to loosen even as she pressed a trembling palm against her chest. She felt the urge to run, yet her feet remained rooted to the tiled floor, held by duty, terror, and a growing sense that turning back was already impossible. Layla lifted her chin with soft fingers, offering a reassurance that felt as fragile as a candle wick before the storm. Then muffled footsteps approached from behind the partition. They halted, too deliberate, too aware. The attendant stiffened. Layla's hand froze midway through adjusting Eleni's veil. The lamps flickered as though startled. Eleni's pulse faltered, then surged. She sensed the arrival of someone whose judgment could fracture or reshape her path entirely. The curtain remained closed, its fabric breathing with the movement behind it. Whatever crossed that threshold next would decide who she became inside these walls. The selection hall shimmered beneath lanterns suspended. Like captive stars, each slow sway scattering fractured gold across marble pillars carved with imperial verses. Sister Eleni stepped onto the mosaic floor, her breath catching as the hall's vastness swallowed the sound of her heartbeat. Senior concubines drifted around her, their steps soft enough to resemble feathers hiding sharpened blades. Their veils trembled with restrained rivalry, the faintest flicker in their eyes revealing calculations sharpened over years of surviving court politics. She felt their scrutiny like invisible fingers, testing the seams of her composure. Behind a silk screen, court musicians released trembling notes into the air. The sound threaded itself into her pulse until her fear, and the rhythm blended into a single, trembling cadence. Each plucked string seemed to pull her further from the life she once knew, drawing her toward an arena where beauty and danger intertwined without mercy. The scent of burning amber drifted along the hall, warm and sweet enough to mask the unease tightening her throat. Eleni's gaze settled on a cushioned dais near the far wall. Upon it lay a recovered letter penned by a vanished favorite. The parchment had yellowed, but its warning remained vivid. Admiration from the Sultan was not a path, but a corridor from which no footsteps returned unchanged. She traced its edges with her eyes, feeling guilt gnaw beneath her ribs. If she were chosen, what fate would befall the others who stood beside her now, trembling in silence? Layla Hatun lingered near the archway, her presence a quiet anchor amid the hall's tension. She offered a single steadying glance, a fragile assurance that Eleni was not entirely alone within these gilded walls. Eleni inhaled, forcing her shoulders to remain lifted even as dread pressed downward with the weight of an unseen hand. Then the musicians fell silent. The curtains at the chamber's end stirred, their gold-threaded fabric parting with ceremonial slowness. A robed silhouette emerged, framed by candlelight that crowned its edges with fire. The Sultan's presence filled the hall before he spoke or moved. His gaze swept over the assembled women, then halted upon Eleni with an intensity that felt like a verdict delivered without words. The atmosphere thickened, collapsing the distance between them. Her breath faltered. Hope flickered at the edges of her fear, hope that selection could offer protection, or at least survival. Yet dread rose with equal force, whispering that stepping forward meant surrendering pieces of herself she could never reclaim. When the robed figure extended a hand in her direction, every trained movement in the hall paused. Eleni felt the world narrow to the space between her heartbeat and the gesture that summoned her. She stepped forward, uncertain whether she advanced toward elevation or erasure, or whether both would claim her before dawn. The inner harem glowed with deceptive splendor, its gold-threaded curtains drifting like nets designed to catch dreams before suffocating them. Sister Eleni followed closely behind Layla Hatun, the velvet beneath their feet swallowing every footstep. The silence felt performed rather than natural, stretched across the corridors like an elaborate veil intended to hide the machinery of control. Whispered voices clung to the air like dust motes suspended in lamplight, their meaning broken into fragments of envy, warning, and ritualized obedience. Halime Sultan ruled the central chamber with a poise sharpened by survival. Her movements were graceful, yet every tilt of her head carried an authority that reminded the room who among them understood the true architecture of power. Women bowed as she passed, their veils concealing alliances as fragile as pressed flowers preserved between the pages of a forbidden book. The soft jingle of her bracelets rang with the clarity of steel disguised in gold. Eleni's gaze drifted toward a marble pedestal upon which rested an excavation clue, a carved fragment bearing the names of an ancient faction of harem women who once shaped imperial tides from behind sealed doors. The fragment's surface held faint grooves from generations of hands tracing its warning. Eleni touched its cool edge, sensing how many lives had risen, or vanished, around such secrets. Fear coiled around her as she stepped deeper into the chamber. Rival concubines watched her with calculated contempt, brushing past her just closely enough to test her resolve. Their perfume masked the sting of threat beneath sweetness. A tall concubine with embroidered sleeves let her sleeve graze Eleni's wrist, a gesture as cold as sharpened glass. Eleni steadied her breath, refusing to flinch. Layla Hatun paused beside her, offering a subtle nod, an unspoken reminder to observe before acting, to survive before daring anything more. Eleni absorbed the chamber's rhythms, sensing how loyalty braided itself with ambition, how smiles stretched thin over hidden blades. Halime Sultan beckoned her to a private alcove draped in deep crimson silk. Inside, the noise of the chamber dimmed into a hush thick enough to hear the faint crackle of oil lamps. Halime watched her with an expression unreadable yet piercing, the kind of gaze that weighed not only who Eleni was, but who she might become. On a small table lay a dagger with a jeweled hilt. Beneath it, a folded parchment sealed with red wax. Halime's voice carried the softness of velvet while holding the precision of a blade. She spoke of alliances, secrecy, and the empire's shifting horizon. She spoke of the need for women who understood silence but could wield strategy when the palace slept. Eleni felt the moment coil around her like a drawn bowstring. A pact with Halime meant protection, knowledge, and a path carved through the harem's iron-laced hierarchy. But it also meant sacrifice, of safety, of innocence, perhaps of life itself. When Halime extended the parchment toward her, Eleni sensed she stood at a threshold that could either forge her into something formidable or break her before she understood her own power. Thunder crushed the palace roofs with the violence of a world trying to warn them. Each strike rattled the carved wooden latticework of Halime Sultan's secret chamber, sending shivers through the flickering light cast by trembling candles. Their flames bent as though bowing to forces older and more dangerous than the empire itself, bending like nervous conspirators sworn to silence. Sister Eleni stepped across the threshold, her pulse aligning with the storm's growl as it vibrated through the marble floor beneath her feet. The chamber was crowded with shadows rather than people. Coded maps lay unfurled across a low table, their ink glistening under trails of melted wax that dripped in slow, deliberate lines resembling falling empires. Guard rotations, patrol gaps, gate timetables, and hidden servant passages stitched themselves together into a fragile architecture of rebellion. The scent of damp stone mingled with rain leaking through a thin crack in the ceiling, each drop echoing like a countdown. Layla Hatun approached her with a carved look of resolve. She pressed a scorched ledger fragment into Eleni's palm, its brittle surface warm from her touch. The ink revealed testimonies of former uprisings, women once dismissed as harmless orchestrating movements that nearly toppled dynasties. Some names were recorded, others were violently erased, replaced with blank spaces meant to silence memory. Guilt surged through Eleni as she realized how many had risked everything for a freedom she herself had barely dared to imagine. Halime Sultan began assigning roles, her voice low yet heavy with purpose. Each responsibility she outlined felt like a thread tying the women together, binding them to a single fate. One would distract the eunuch guard at the northern gate. Another would smuggle a forged decree beneath a tray of ceremonial sweets. A third would extinguish corridor torches at the appointed moment. Every task shimmered with potential victory and equal ruin. Eleni listened, heart trembling. Fear constricted her chest with each word, yet an ember of defiance glowed beneath it. She felt something in herself shifting, an awakening perhaps, or the breaking of a long-dulled chain. The rebellion relied on her presence now, not simply because she had been chosen, but because she had seen the inner workings of a system designed to consume women like her. She understood its rhythms, its silences, its cruelty disguised as ritual. For the first time since the Bronze Gate swallowed her name, she sensed a fragile chance to reclaim the destiny stolen from her. A candle sputtered violently as Halime reached the final instructions. The storm outside snarled, shaking loose a spray of dust from the ceiling that sifted down like gray snow. The circle of women exchanged glances, each gaze a vow forged in desperation and sharpened by hope. Halime extended her hand, and one by one they placed theirs atop hers, forming a trembling tower of resolve. Eleni felt the warmth of their joined fingers travel up her spine. But before Halime could speak the final oath, a faint scrape echoed from beyond the chamber door. The women froze. The flames leaned away from the sound as if recoiling. Eleni's breath fractured inside her chest. Footsteps, fabric brushing stone, or simply the palace shifting beneath the storm's weight. The scrape came again, soft, deliberate, unmistakably human. Layla's hand tightened around Eleni's wrist. Halime's eyes narrowed, calculating the distance between safety and betrayal. A shadow passed beneath the door's lower frame, too quickly to read, yet heavy enough to darken the air itself. Someone was listening. Fear surged hot and sudden through Eleni, colliding with the defiance she thought she had begun to master. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she imagined the consequences. Confession under duress, public execution, vanishing without recall. RD, or worse, being forced to watch others pay for her hesitation. The room tightened around her, the storm raged, the door remained closed. And Eleni could not tell whether the figure outside carried warning, betrayal, or the silent beginning of her death. Sister Eleni sprinted through corridors choked with smoke, the walls around her trembling as flames devoured the harem's eastern wing with a hunger that felt almost sentient. The roar of the inferno drowned every whispered plan birthed in Halime Sultan's chamber, swallowing their secrets before the empire could. Heat pressed against her skin like a branding iron, forcing her forward even as her lungs burned. Embers drifted through the air and clung to her veil, searing tiny constellations into the fabric, until it resembled a night sky ripped open by fire. A beam overhead groaned before crashing to the ground, scattering sparks across the marble. Beneath its charred surface she glimpsed a chronicler's line, barely visible through soot. Empires remember rebellions only by the ashes they demand. The words carved dread along her spine, their truth too sharp to ignore. She traced the edge of the inscription with shaking fingers, feeling the heat pulse beneath the wood like a warning ready to ignite her resolve. Through the blaze she heard Halime Sultan's voice, sharp yet strained, rising above the chaos like a standard on the verge of collapse. Halime called out names, issued orders, urged women through collapsing hallways. Eleni pushed toward the sound, refusing to allow fire, or fear, to erase the rebellion before its first step had fully formed. The smoke parted briefly, revealing Halime standing atop a fractured staircase, her silhouette framed by flames that painted her like a queen forged in ruin. Eleni staggered toward her, each step a battle against the suffocating air and the panic clawing at her ribs. Her vision blurred, but Halim's outstretched arm remained clear, a single unbroken line of authority amid the crumbling world. Just as Eleni reached for her, a violent crack split the air. The balcony above them gave way. A cascade of burning wood plummeted between them, sealing the corridor with roaring fire and forcing Halim to retreat. The shockwave knocked Eleni backward, slamming her into a pillar. Pain radiated through her shoulder. She gasped as smoke flooded her throat, tasting ash, fear, and the bitter sting of failure. Cut off, alone, no clear path forward. The flames gathered around her like a closing fist, their heat distorting the world into wavering shapes. Eleni pressed her trembling hand to her chest, feeling her heart hammer against the weight of the moment. She tried to steady her breath, but the smoke fought her for every inhale. The fire reflected in her eyes, turning them bright with terror and determination alike. Survival no longer meant reaching Halim. It meant confronting the consequences that would outlive these flames: retribution, exposure, or the dismantling of everything they had risked to build. The inferno growled, the ceiling groaned, and the air pulsed as though the palace itself awaited her decision. She staggered to her feet, unsure which direction still held life. She had no certainty survival was within reach. Only the fire answered her, refusing to forget. Dawn settled over the ruins in muted gold, softening none of the devastation as Sister Eleni stumbled toward the outer gate. Her breath trembled, carrying the weight of smoke, grief, and the echo of women's cries that refused to fade. The ground beneath her feet was still warm from the night's inferno, each step releasing the scent of charred silk and scorched cedar. In her hand she clutched a recovered letter, its edges burned and curling inward like petals consumed by flame. It bore the names of those lost, names she traced with soot-blackened fingers, each stroke carving guilt deeper into her chest. Yet beneath the grief pulsed a reluctant thread of hope, fragile but alive. Layla Hatton's distant cry pierced the morning air, urging her to flee before guards reclaimed control and rebuilt the palace's machinery of silence. But Eleni hesitated. The smoldering corridors behind her still murmured with unfinished truths, with secrets that had survived even the flames. She felt them tug at her spine, asking whether escape meant betrayal, not only of the rebellion but of the women who could no longer speak for themselves. She pushed against the iron gate. It groaned, its hinges dragging like an elder unwilling to release one final witness. The resistance felt almost sentient, as though the empire itself tightened its grip around her name before deciding whether to let it go. She leaned her weight against the cold metal, her muscles shaking with exhaustion and doubt. Then a horn sounded deep within the courtyard. Its tone rolled across the ruins, neither warning nor welcome, neither command nor mercy. It was a summons wrapped in ambiguity, its meaning unreadable. Eleni froze mid-step, the light catching the soot across her cheeks and turning her expression into something caught between survivor and ghost. Her breath stilled. She could not tell whether she was being called back to answer for rebellion, hunted for the knowledge she carried, or chosen for a legacy written in sacrifice rather than freedom. The gate waited, the courtyard watched, and the next step would decide which world claimed her name.